I realize not all women are mothers. And so I wanted to bring a message that related to both mothers and non-mothers. Before I do, let me mention one of my favorite Mother Day lines. It is a question. Question. If evolution was factual, then why do mothers have only two hands? Some of you won't get it till this afternoon, but think about it. If evolution was factual, why do mothers only have two hands? Because they need more than that, is probably, but for sure. Anyway, I'm speaking this morning on an ancient biblical character, a fantastic woman named Abigail. Abigail, one of our granddaughters, is an Abigail. She is Abigail Lynn Webb. She is sweet 16 and finishing up her sophomore year of high school. Charles Swindoll has suggested that this chapter we're about to read from 1 Samuel 25 resembles a four-act theatrical performance. A four-act theatrical performance. First, there's an introduction of the cast. Second, there's the conflict the plot is built around. Then third, there's escalating action that brings about a climax. And then fourth, there's a conclusion that resolves the conflict. I want us to go through each of these acts, starting at Act 1, the cast. There are three principal cast members in this account, and those characters are David. David would become Israel's second king, but he wasn't king at the time of this narrative. He isn't king. Saul is king. Then Nabal, either one. Nabal, and then Abigail. Those are the three primary cast members. This narrative begins after David loses his composure and in the process almost murders someone if it had not been for this special woman named Abigail. And only God knows how many women have kept men from doing some stupid things, and this is one of those instances. David had been running from Israel's first king, Saul, for months. He'd been running for months because Saul was extremely jealous of David and wanted to assassinate him. David had managed to convince 600 men to help defend himself against Saul. That meant David had a small army at his disposal. In order for David to feed those 600 men and their families, he accepted employment as a special police security force. He accepted employment as a special police security force. And doing that for all the farmers in the region as protection against different bands of thieves that roamed the area. In payment for his services, the farmers would then provide food and provide monies for David and his men who had protected them. In particular, David's men had protected servants and flocks belonging to a man named Nabal. David sent 10 of his men to see Nabal in order to collect his rightful compensation for the security David's men had given Nabal's servants. Now, it is important to understand that there wasn't a written contract guaranteeing this payment. That didn't exist. It was a gentleman's agreement. It was something that was expected, not unlike tipping a waitress that gives someone good service at a restaurant. It is expected. It was just an understood practice that at sheep shearing time, an owner, a farmer, a rancher, was to pay those persons who had been protecting his servants and protecting his animals. But there was a problem, and that problem was that Nabal refused to pay those men of David's. And so the beginning problem is basically an employer-employee conflict. David was the employee that got ripped off by his employer, Nabal. But instead of just protesting and saying, this isn't fair, you owe us, David decided to go ballistic in anger, uncontrollable anger, and commit the ultimate act of workplace violence. David actually planned to execute Nabal and execute all the men of his household. Let's meet Nabal. Verse 2. Now there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. This is a different Carmel than the Carmel in California. That's a beautiful place. I've been there. Clint Eastwood was the mayor there. This is a different Carmel. And this man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel, meaning his servants were doing the shearing. Verse 3, the name of the man was Nabal, and in the name of his wife, Abigail. So, Nabal and Abigail are married. And she was a woman of good understanding and beautiful appearance. Those are good qualities she possessed. But notice the contrast between Abigail and Nabal. The man, Nabal, was harsh and evil in his doings. Those are not good qualities. He was of the household or the house of Caleb. This is interesting. Nabal was a descendant of Caleb. Remember Caleb and his friend Joshua, 2 of the 12 spies that Moses sent into Canaan, the promised land, to do some reconnaissance and determine what the land was like. That's the same Caleb. This man Nabal is a descendant from. Now the name Nabal means fool. That's the meaning of his name. I don't know why parents name their children some of the names these children receive. That was a terrible name. But that is exactly what Nabal was. Nabal was extremely rich. According to verse 2, and according to verse 3, he was also, notice, harsh, meaning he was stern, rude, and overbearing. And in addition, he was said to be evil in all his doings. And there's no part of evil that is good. Nabal was a ruthless businessman. That's who he was. But notice he was married to a woman named Abigail, who was altogether different from her husband. And being different from our mate is not necessarily a bad thing. Now, it was in this case, but on a normal basis, it is not necessarily a bad thing to be different from our mate. In fact, if two people in a marriage are identical, then one of them is unnecessary. So opposites do attract. Now, this was not just two people that are opposite in personality types, because that happens all the time. Hopi and I are opposite in personalities. Hang around us for 30 seconds, and it is apparent that Hopi and I have opposing or different personalities. And some other marriages in this room are opposites. Some might be more opposites than even our marriage. And that's okay, because opposites attract, and most often that is a good thing. But Nabal and Abigail were not just opposite in personalities, but they were direct opposites in character. That is not a good thing. Nabal was a bad person, an evil person, and Abigail was a good person. So how did that happen? How did a good person like Abigail become married to a bad and evil person like Nabal? Here's how it happened. In ancient societies, fathers prearranged marriages. That meant earlier on, Abigail's father and Nabal's father decided that their children should be married to one another. And that's how it happened, demonstrating that arranged marriages that still happen in some Islamic countries under Sharia law are not a good system. Now notice verse 3 reads, Abigail was a person of good understanding, meaning she was an intelligent woman. She had much insight into people and problems, and she had a beautiful appearance. And all men love a beautiful woman. Abigail had brains and beauty, which are highly desirable qualities in a woman. A piece of trivia, the name Abigail, remember her husband's name means fool. The name Abigail means cause of joy. cause of joy. And that's what Abigails do. To be married to a woman that is an Abigail brings a man much joy. Being married to an Abigail is about as good as it gets. So those are the cast members. Act 2 is the conflict. The conflict is found in verses 4 through 13. Now, notice how David's men ask Nabal for this payment, reimbursement or remuneration for their services of protecting his servants and flocks. Verse 4, when David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep, David sent 10 young men. And David said to the young men, go up to Carmel, go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus you shall say to him who lives in prosperity. David recognized that he was rich. Peace be to you, peace to your house, and peace to all that you have. Verse 7, now I have heard that you have shearers. Your shepherds were with us, and we did not hurt them, nor was there anything missing from them all the while they were in Carmel. Verse 8, ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Now notice, please give whatever comes to your hand to your servants and to your son David. Now David wanted his men, in requesting payment for their services, he wanted them to tell Nabal, listen, whatever you think would be appropriate to give us in financial remuneration, whatever it is that would be acceptable to us. Verse 9, so David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal according to all these words in the name of David and waited. Now, David did not personally go see Nabal, probably because he didn't want to intimidate him. Now, notice it was a warm greeting. David's servants announced to Nabal, peace be to you, peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. So David's men weren't going there demanding. These men said to Nabal, please give us whatever comes to your hand, to your servants, and your son David. Essentially, David's men said to Nabal, whatever you feel is appropriate, whatever you feel is fair, whatever you feel is reasonable, just give that to us. David expected that his men would be compensated a reasonable and fair wage. And that's the reason he didn't tell them to request a particular amount. So these men said to Nabal, just do whatever you feel you are able to do. But notice Nabal's response to these men. Verse 10. Then Nabal answered David's servants and said, this is interesting. Who is David? Who is this David? And who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants nowadays who break away each one from his master. So Nabal's playing dumb. He goes, who's David? Who was a son of Jesse? Like, he must be a rogue servant. I don't know him. I haven't heard of him. Now that was bogus, but that's what he said. Verse 11, shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men when I do not know where they are from? Verse 12, so David's young men turned on their heels and went back, and they came and told him, David, all these words. So Nabal had pretended not to know who David was. That was completely bogus. That wasn't theoretically possible that he would not know who David was, because David was recognized throughout that entire region. David was a household name. Nabal argued that David was probably just some renegade out in the field. He acted as though he didn't know David, and he played dumb. He played dumb so as to excuse his own unwillingness to fully compensate David's men. Nabal completely blew off all that David and his men had done for him. He was an arrogant, self-centered, ungrateful jerk. And that was on a good day. In verses 17 and 25, Nabal is called a scoundrel. Scoundrel. The word scoundrel means troublemaker. troublemaker. Nabal was called that name not just as a label to distinguish him from someone else. He was called that derogatory name to give us some profound insight into his character. Nabal was not a nice man. And especially he wasn't nice to David and his servants who had protected his household. Now notice David's reaction to Nabal's refusal to compensate his workers. Verse 13. This is a serious reaction. Then David said to his men, every man gird on his sword. So every man girded on his sword. And David also girded on his sword. And about 400 men went with David. And 200 stayed behind with the supplies. So David had 400 of his men armed themselves with swords. He also armed himself with his sword. And together, all of those men went to meet Nabal. I don't know much about military tactics, but I'm guessing those 400 armed troops weren't planning to just sit around a cup of coffee and discuss this matter. It would seem David didn't have diplomacy in mind. David and his men were prepared to execute Nabal and execute all of his male servants. I understand David being upset because a gross injustice had been committed against him. He had a legitimate reason to react in a righteous indignation. But David's reaction against Nabal's wrong action was a definite overreaction. Come on, 400 armed soldiers against one unreasonable, unarmed jerk. No, that's not fair. That's analogous to attacking a cockroach using a bazooka. That was a definite overkill. And it was also misdirected overreaction because Nabal himself was the singular problem here. Not Nabal's men, not Nabal's servants. Nabal's shepherds were innocent. In fact, in verses 14 through 16, one of Nabal's servants commended David's men and seemed appreciative of the job those men had done. But David was raging mad at all things Nabal. So he was unreasonable and overreactionary in his reaction to that announcement. Part 3. This is Act 3, the climax. This is found in verses 14 through 35. So one of Nabal's servants reported to Abigail all that had just happened between her husband and David and his servants. Verse 14. Now one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, look, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, and he, Nabal, reviled them. Revile means to use unacceptable and abusive language toward someone, to defame someone. Verse 15, that is what Nabal did. He defamed David and his servants, reviled them. But the men, David's men, were very good to us, and we were not hurt, nor did we miss anything as long as we accompanied them when we were in the fields. Verse 16, they were a wall to us, a protective wall to us, both by night and day, all the time we were with them, keeping the sheep. Meaning David's men did a fantastic job at protecting this servant, the other servants, and all the herds. Verse 17, now therefore know and consider what you will do. Again, the servant is talking to Abigail, Nabal's wife. Therefore, know and consider what you will do. For harm is determined against our master and against all his household. Meaning he's aware of the fact that David and his men are coming armed, and her husband is in danger, and his servants. For he is such a scoundrel that no one can speak to him. No one could speak to Nabal because he wouldn't listen. This man was unapproachable, unreasonable, unteachable, stubborn, and stupid. The critical phrase is mentioned in verse 17, where this servant said to Abigail, notice this phrase, now therefore know and consider what you will do. The question this morning is, what would you have done, ladies? If you had been Abigail, what would you have done about this situation? Your husband put you in a terrible position. Remember, throughout this marriage, she had to contend with Nabal's rude insults, his indifference, his hardness of heart, his selfishness and inconsideration. So ladies, what would you do if you were married to someone like Nabal? And shooting him is not an option. Notice some of the personal qualities Abigail manifested in handling this situation. She was a phenomenal woman. Notice, first, she was determined. Determined. Verse 18, then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves of bread. It takes substantial time to bake 200 loaves of bread. 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already dressed, meaning butchered and prepared to eat, and 5 seahs of toasted or roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs. She prepared an incredible amount of food. And notice it is said that Abigail made haste. Abigail didn't, after hearing this announcement, panic and start falling to pieces. She was a woman of determined action, and she immediately started to find a solution to this problem. Abigail was a problem solver. It wasn't her problem per se, in the sense that she didn't create this situation, but she still attempted to resolve this problem. And in doing that, notice, she started the first catering service in history. That's what she did. Seriously. Remember, the person that says, I can, and the person that says, I can't, are both right. Abigail was determined and said, I can do something. I can do something about this situation. And she did. Second, notice she was supportive. She was supportive. Verse 19, and she, Abigail, said to her servants, go before me. See, I am coming after you. This is critical. Notice, but she did not tell her husband, Nabal. Abigail had a dysfunctional marriage. And probably most women in that situation would have just allowed David's vengeance to run its course. And if Nabal died as a result of his own stupidity, then oh well, he got what was coming to him. And she would have been released from a miserable marriage. But Abigail had more character than to just sit there and let her husband do something stupid and get himself killed. She didn't mention to Nabal what she was doing, but understand something. She wasn't working in secret against him. She was working behind his back for his benefit. She was working behind his back, attempting to save his life. Nabal was not even close to what he should have been as a mate, but Abigail still supported him as much as she could. And that was an incredible quality. I have seen some gifted men who did not succeed because they were married to women who didn't support them and didn't encourage them and didn't want to join them in ministering to people. I had a close friend that was called to public ministry, but he dropped out of the pastorate because his wife just didn't want to be married to a pastor. Now, we have an unusual background. We were married at 19. Not recommended. But when we were first married, I was in college and I was wanting to become an engineer. And I have an undergraduate degree in engineering, and I have forgotten everything I ever learned, but I have a piece of paper on my wall. So Opie thought she was going to be married to an engineer. We were active in church, extremely active in church, but neither one of us had any idea I would become a pastor. I didn't. I was opposed to that concept. But I'm blessed because the moment I announced to Hopi what I felt, I believe God wanted me to do, from that moment, Hopi has supported me. She said, you know, if you're going to be a pastor, I'm going to be a pastor's wife. So I'm going to change some things. And she did. She was extraordinarily shy and bashful. And she came out of her shell, and she's still going to be on the shy side, but she came out of her shell, and she has been an incredible servant, an incredible asset to me. She has supported me. encouraged me and partnered with me in all the churches where we have been, and she wouldn't let me quit if I wanted to. And there have been times I have wanted to. She refused to accept that, and I'm grateful. She's an Abigail in that sense. She's supportive. C, notice, number 3, she was courageous. Courageous, verse 20. So it was, as she rode on the donkey, that she went down under cover of the hill. And there were David and his men coming down toward her, and she met them. So David and 400 men, armed men, and here's Abigail riding down, and they're meeting. Verse 21, now David had said, surely in vain I have protected all that this fellow has in his wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belongs to him. And he has repaid me evil for good. Verse 22, may God do so, and more also, to the enemies of David, if I leave one male of all who belong to him by morning light. David was determined to take no prisoners. This was a pretty scary situation. David and 400 sword-wielding men came down the mountainside, determined to cut Nabal in half. And then Abigail came out to meet them. And probably all she had as a weapon was a crock pot. That was courage. That was courage. Rosa Parks is considered the mother of the civil rights movement. This is Rosa as a younger woman. She was arrested on December 1st, 1955, for refusing to give up her bus seat to a white man. She was sitting in the, quote, colored section of the bus. And why that sort of segregation ever existed is, I have no idea. But the white section in front of the bus had been filled. So the bus driver, James F. Blake, a white man, demanded she give up her seat so that this white man wouldn't have to stand. She said no. Blake said, why don't you stand up? She responded, I don't think I should have to stand up. And she shouldn't have had to have stood up. The driver was less than a man in expecting her to respond, expecting any woman of any color to give up her seat to another man. That's misogyny. Misogyny is this erroneous attitude that man is somehow superior to a woman, and that is wrong. That is not true. A man should always give up his seat to a woman if he is able to do so. It doesn't matter what color she is, and especially was it heinous because she was a woman of color. She refused. She was arrested, and because of that defiance, she was also fired as a seamstress in the local department store. Boycotts and protests ensued, and as a result, the United States Supreme Court eventually ruled racial segregation is unconstitutional. Now, Rosa Parks said this about what happened on that bus. I have learned over the years that knowing what must be done does away with fear. When I sat down on the bus that day, I had no idea history was being made. I was only thinking of getting home. But I had made up my mind. After so many years of being a victim of the mistreatment my people suffered, not giving up my seat, and whatever I had to face afterwards was not important. I did not feel any fear sitting there. I felt the Lord would give me the strength to endure whatever I had to face. It was time for someone to stand up, or in my case, sit down. So I refused to move. Rosa Parks was a committed Christian. She once made the statement, quote, as a child, I learned from the Bible to trust in God and not to be afraid. Rosa Parks was a courageous woman, and God blessed that courage more than she could ever have imagined. Piece of trivia, this was not Rosa's first time to meet bus driver Blake. 12 years earlier, she had boarded his bus. She had paid the fare. She then sat down on the bus But Blake told her to get up, exit the bus, and re-enter the bus through the rear door, which would have been very difficult. She didn't argue. She did get up, as she had been told to do. She exited the bus, but before she could re-enter the bus, Blake drove off and left Rosa to walk home in the rain. People, just reading that infuriates me. How can we possibly treat another person made in the image of God like that with such great disrespect? That's nauseating to God. And to add even more insult, after those incidences, James Blake never apologized to Rosa Parks. And until his death, he continued to justify his ugly racism. I might add, Rosa was an amazing woman. Her funeral was 7 hours in length. Christian, if you determine to do what is right, then God will give you the courage to do it, just as he did Rosa Parks and just as he did Abigail. Number 4, she was humble. Verse 23. Now when Abigail saw David, she dismounted quickly from the donkey, fell on her face before David. So she's on the ground and bowed down to the ground. She's on the ground. Her face is on the ground in front of David. Verse 24. So she fell at his feet and said, "Oh, on me, my Lord, on me let this iniquity be. And please let your maidservant," meaning herself, "speak in your ears and hear the words of your maidservant." Notice, Abigail dismounted from this donkey, bowed to the ground in front of David, and humbly positioning herself to accept any form of punishment he might inflict on her as a result of what her foolish husband had done to him. Abigail actually apologized to David for what Nabal had done. She apologized not for what she had done. She had done nothing wrong. She is an innocent victim here. But she apologized for what her foolish husband had done. Sometimes I have had to apologize for other people's actions. I had done nothing, but other people had. People connected to me. I had to apologize to them. I've had to apologize for different people that I have pastored that brought shame to the church and shame to themselves and shame to Jesus Christ. Humility means a willingness to go to someone who has been offended and ask them for forgiveness. And sometimes, even if you aren't the actual guilty party, that has to happen. And that's what Abigail did. Someone said, "How do I know if I'm humble?" You don't. Someone wrote a book called Humility and How I Obtained It. That's not a good book. And if you think you're humble, then you're probably not. Someone else has to see humility in us and mention it to us. And even then, if we're actually humble, we aren't going to acknowledge it. We can't see it. Abigail was humble, and she demonstrated that humility in front of David. Number 5, she was honest. Honest, verse 25. Please let not my Lord regard this scoundrel Nabal, for as his name is, and remember Nabal meant fool, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your maidservant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Meaning she wasn't at that meeting where the servants went to seek remuneration for what they had done. Verse 26, now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord lives and your soul lives, since the Lord has held you back from coming to bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek harm for my Lord be as Nabal. There is a difference between harsh criticism and honest realism in relating to our mate in marriage. Abigail was honest and realistic about the character of her husband. She said that her husband was a scoundrel and a fool. His name Nabal meant fool, as we said earlier. And the word fool also has a connotation of someone that is morally deficient, and he was that. Although she understood that she was responsible to support her husband, Abigail was also honest enough to acknowledge to David what her husband was, and she also wanted David to understand that she was totally unaware of any business arrangement between Nabal and David's servants. She hadn't been present. She wasn't aware of that. Abigail was thoroughly honest about this situation. And notice number 6, she was generous. Generous, verse 27. Now this present meaning all this food she had brought, and the items that were mentioned in verse 18, this present which your maidservant, meaning herself, has brought to my Lord, meaning David, let it be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Meaning, I prepared all this food for your men who serve to protect my husband's men, servants, and herds. Because Nabal wouldn't feed his men, Abigail had prepared a generous amount of food for those extremely hungry men. That was not something she was obligated to do. Abigail was more than a go-getter. She was a go-giver. Tony Evans is one of my favorite communicators. He pastors in South Dallas. He mentions in one of his books an account of a small boy who did his household chores and then left his mother this note. The note read, "For cleaning my room, $5. For washing dishes, $3. For raking the leaves, $10. Mom, the total you owe me is $18. The mother found this note right after her son had gone to school. She read that note, and as he requested, she put $18 on the table beside the note. But beside the money, she left her own note. That note said, "Son, for bearing you in my womb and for throwing up 3 of those months, no charge. For making your meals each day, no charge. For washing and ironing your clothes, no charge. For staying up all night when you were sick, no charge. Son, you don't owe me anything because I love you." That's what moms do. Moms are generous. And that was Abigail. Number 7, she was wise. Verse 28, she said to David, "Please forgive the trespass of your maidservant," meaning herself. She hadn't done anything wrong. She acted as though she had, but she wasn't or hadn't. "For the Lord will certainly make my Lord," that's David, "an enduring house, because my Lord fights the battles of the Lord, and evil is not found in you throughout your days." Abigail was wise enough to remind David of his reputation at that time. This was pre-Bathsheba. David committed moral failure with Bathsheba, but that would happen much later after this, after David had become king. This was prior to that. And notice the phrase, she said, "and evil is not found in you throughout your days." Basically, Abigail said, you can't just kill my husband and his men. He deserves to die, but you can't do that because that would be an evil thing to do. And David, evil is just not a part of who you are. She appealed to David's conscience and his sense of right and wrong. And that was a smart and wise technique. Number 8, she was optimistic. She was optimistic. Verse 29, "Yet a man has risen to pursue you and seek your life. But the life of my Lord," meaning David, "shall be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the pocket of a sling." This phrase, that David shall be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God, reflects the practice of binding valuables in a piece of cloth, wrapping the cloth around some valuables in a bundle in order to protect them from damage. This means that God was caring for David just as a man might care for a valuable treasure through wrapping it in a heavy cloth. According to Abigail, David was the recipient of divine protection. What she felt was evidence that God had something special in store for David. And that optimism continued. Verse 30. And it shall come to pass when the Lord has done for my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you ruler over Israel. Verse 31, that this will be no grief to you, nor offense of heart to my Lord, either that you have shed blood without cause, or that my Lord has avenged himself. But when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your maidservant. She wanted him not to forget what she had done, even though her husband had wronged him. She wanted him to know that she had tried to do right. Abigail was certain that David would ultimately be the ruler over all Israel after Saul's death. And he was. But in the meantime, she didn't want him to do anything that might endanger his potential throne. She didn't want him to do anything stupid that might jeopardize his future by seeking personal vengeance and murdering someone such as Nabal and his men. Abigail was optimistic that what God had in store for David was special, and she didn't want him to frustrate God's plan. Just as a modern woman named Mrs. Paul Pearsall did. In his book called The 10 Laws of Lasting Love, Paul Pearsall describes something he faced against cancer. Paul Pearsall was a renowned neuropsychologist. He said this, anytime a doctor came with news of my progress, my wife would join me in a mutual embrace. The reports were seldom good during the early phases of my illness. And one day, a doctor brought a particularly frightening news. Gazing at his clipboard, he murmured, "It doesn't look like you're going to make it." Before I could ask a question of this doomsayer, my wife stood up, handed me my robe, adjusted the tubes attached to my body, and said, "Let's get out of here. This man is a risk to your health." And she helped me struggle to the door. The doctor approached us. "Stay back," demanded my wife. "Stay away from us." As we walked together down the hall, the doctor attempted to catch up with us. "Keep going," said my wife, pushing the intravenous stand. "We're going to talk to someone who really knows what's going on." Then she held up her hand to the doctor and said, "Don't come any closer to us." The two of them moved as one. We fled to the safety and hope of a doctor who did not confuse diagnosis with verdict. I could never have made that walk toward wellness alone. Mrs. Pearsall had that same sort of determined optimism regarding her husband as Abigail did. Dr. Pearsall is now deceased. He died from an unrelated cause. But he experienced a total recovery from stage 4 bone cancer. That is rare. Then notice starting in verse 32 how David reacted to Abigail's interference. It seems that he was impressed and grateful that she cautioned him against doing what he'd earlier planned to do, and that was to kill Nabal. Verse 32, then David said to Abigail, "Blessed is the Lord God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. And blessed is your advice, and blessed are you, because you have kept me this day from coming to bloodshed and avenging myself with my own hands. For indeed, as the Lord God of Israel lives, who has kept me back from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, surely by morning light no males would have been left to Nabal." So David received from her hand what she had brought him. He accepted this present of food and said to her, "Go up in peace to your house. See, I have heeded your voice and respected your person." Do you understand what just happened here? Abigail essentially changed David's mind. David's mind was intent on murder. Murder Nabal, murder his servants. But he changed his mind as a result of her interference. He decided not to inflict bodily harm on either Nabal or his servants. Instead, he accepted the food she brought him, and then he went back to his camp. Now notice the surprise ending, though. Act 4 is the conclusion. Verse 36, now Abigail went to Nabal, and there he was, holding a feast in his house. He's having a party. Like the feast of a king, a big party. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. Therefore she told him nothing, little or much, until morning light. Verse 37, so it was in the morning, when the wine had gone from Nabal and his wife had told him these things, that his heart died within him, and he became like a stone. Then it happened after about 10 days that the Lord struck Nabal and he died. So Abigail came home after meeting with David, and she found Nabal basically plastered and having a huge party. He was still a jerk. He had been so intoxicated, he didn't even bother asking where Abigail had been. Abigail understood that in his drunken condition, it would be useless to talk to him, so she waited until he had sobered up in the morning. Then Abigail told him all that had happened. And as soon as Nabal heard that David had originally intended to kill him, he had a severe stroke and became paralyzed until he died some 10 days after that. And that was the end of Nabal. Good riddance. Verse 39, it gets better. So David heard that Nabal was dead. He said, "Blessed be the Lord, who has pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal, and has kept his servant from evil. For the Lord has returned the wickedness of Nabal on his own head." And David sent and proposed to Abigail to take her as his wife. When the servants of David had come to Abigail of Carmel, they spoke to her, saying, "David sent us to you to ask you to become his wife." Then she arose, bowed her face to the earth, and said, "Here is your maidservant, a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord." So Abigail rose in haste, rode on a donkey, attended by 5 of her maidens, and she followed the messengers of David, and she became his wife. If you like love stories, this is one of the best. Notice at the end of this strange account that justice was done and a wrong was righted. Abigail's bad marriage was ended and a new and better marriage began. That is a classic case of an Old Testament Cinderella meeting her Prince Charming. Abigail was a fantastic specimen representing the female gender. She had the strength of character to solve problems. She was supportive when most women would have walked out of an unbearable situation. She had internal strength and courage. She was humble and honest and wise and optimistic. I know enough to know there are Abigails in this room. And there are some younger women in this room that are planning to become an Abigail. Question, are you an Abigail? Are you attempting to become an Abigail? And for young men who are single and eligible, men, don't settle for anyone less than an Abigail. And married men, if you are fortunate to be married to an Abigail, thank God for that woman and that Abigail he gave you, because you are blessed. Let's bow our heads. I don't know of any Nabals in this room, Father. I don't know every man, but these are good men in this room, and I don't know anyone who even resembles a Nabal. But there are women in this room who are Abigails, and there's no question. And there are other women in this room who aspire to become an Abigail, and I pray that you will help them to reach that objective. I'm so grateful for this story and the lessons we learned from it. No one's perfect, I understand that, but you're a God of another chance and another chance and another chance, and I'm grateful for those chances. Thank you for this incredible woman that we learned so much from this morning, Abigail. Thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.